So I just recently passed 100 subscribers, and so that's awesome. Thank you. I guess you can consider this kind of like the 100 sub video. I really appreciate it, but you guys, I'm sure, just want to hear the random songwriter, so let's just make a song. Some of you might remember that 4 months ago I made a video called My Random Music Generator or something like that, where I dug up some old code from 2016. I organized it, I made it more efficient, something like that, and it wrote music, but it didn't write a song. So there were several problems with the music that the code wrote. It lacked structure, and it only wrote one MIDI track. This version solves that. My code now writes MIDI for a 5-part song with drums, guitar, bass, and a lead instrument. Before I explain my code, here's a brief intro to some basic concepts. MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, and you can think of it as sheet music for computers. It's how I program my drums, synthesizers, any virtual instrument really. Every note has its own integer MIDI note value, at least in the standard 12-tone equal temperament system. MIDI note values are basically just counting in base 12 with C being 0 and B being 11, and it's repeating. This works well with pitched instruments such as piano, synthesizers, accordions, whatever. For drums, however, different kit pieces are assigned MIDI note values. While there are standards for what pieces get what value, it's still kind of an arbitrary thing. Back to the explanation. There were two things I needed for this whole thing to even work in the first place. I needed the actual program that would write the multi-track MIDI item. Then I needed a Reaper template that you could just put a MIDI item in and everything would fall into place. Let's just go to template first. My program writes MIDI. It does not write sound. I need instruments to be played by this MIDI. For the drums, I'm using Get Good Drums Modern and Massive kit. For the lead instrument, I'm using T-Force Alpha Plus, a free synthesizer. I sampled my guitar and bass using Resamplomatic 5000 to create programmable guitar and bass. This was relatively easy, just time consuming. I recorded DIs straight out of the guitar and bass. I recorded several notes and I pitch shifted them up and down to fill in all the gaps. Then I sent the programmed DIs through my regular effects chains. An important thing to notice is my sample guitar. I sampled both open strings and muted strings. If the velocity is below half, the muted samples are played. If it is above half, the open samples are played. A few tips on making sampled guitar and bass sound a little bit more realistic is to increase the release time. Another thing is to sample the DI, sample what you are going to put into distortion. Don't sample after distortion, because pitch shifting that sounds a lot less convincing than pitch shifting DIs. I'll give a brief overview of my code. If you want to just see the code, I'm going to put that on GitHub. It can be broken down into 4 parts. First, it generates a random 5-part structure. Second, writes each of those parts to an individual 3D list. Third, it adds them together, and fourth, it converts the list to MIDI and then exports. Part 1. Generate a random 5-part structure. These songs will consist of 3 components: verse, chorus, and breakdown, or 0, 1, and 2. This can be done using the random library and the randint function. Easy. Part 2. Write these parts to individual 3D lists. Let's call this list notes. Doesn't really matter, but list notes is a 3D list. It can be thought of as a list of 2D lists. Each of these 2D lists represents an instrument. So let's fill the list with a super simple riff to get a basic idea. Start with the bass, as it is fairly simple. The 2D bass list has 2 lists. One is for the MIDI note values and the other is for the length of these notes. To represent rests, I will place a -1 in the MIDI note value list. Here's a very simple bass line. Let's hear how it sounds. The synth array has the exact same 2 lists, one being note values and the other being the length of those notes. The guitar is a bit more complicated. If I want to be able to have basic 3-part chords, I need 3 lists, one for each separate voice. I want to be able to control whether or not the guitar is palm muted, so that's another list, plus the last list for the length of each note. Let's listen to this first riff. Pay attention to the palm mute list. Every note with a 0 is palm muted, every note with a 1 will be open. Now let's listen to the second riff, which adds a 5th, or power chord, to the first note. The drum list is it's similar to the guitar list. I will have multiple notes playing at the same time, so I will need multiple lists, kind of like a chord. I'll have a list for the kick, snare, and cymbal of choosing, plus the list for the note lengths. Let's fill this in and give it a listen, starting with the kick. Let's add the snare now, and the cymbals. And while we're at it, let's just combine all the instruments. These lists are filled in randomly for each type of chorus, verse, and breakdown, and I use loops, random chord progressions, random rhythms, just pretty much anything that I can make random. For example, I might have a metalcore style verse, and that's just where you take basic chord progression, and then maybe it's palm muted sometimes not palm muted. Just kind of random stuff like that. Part 3. Combine the separate parts. Part 4. Convert the list to MIDI using MIDI util. Using the MIDI util library, I can create a new MIDI file with 4 tracks. Then I simply loop through the 3D list and use the add note function to add all the notes. It then exports the file. The file name is incremented every time a file is created, and the new file name is saved to filename.txt. So, that was my random metal songwriter. Hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see the code, description. Thank you again for 100 subs. It's kind of crazy. I mean, I know 100 isn't a lot, but it's cool. So I appreciate it. I will see you all soon.